If you've ever stumbled across an online article about the James Bond franchise and scrolled down to the comments section, you've probably discovered that there's a war between two factions within the James Bond fan base. You have the people who think it's a great time to be a James Bond fan, and that the new James Bond movies are among the best, if not the best, in the series. Then you have the people who don't like the new James Bond movies, argue that they don't even really count as Bond movies, and that the series peaked when it began in the early 1960s. Which side am I on? Well, why don't you take a wild guess? Let's see, I've basically made my entire YouTube career out of saying that franchises that used to be good no longer are. So yeah, I love the old Bond movies and am not thrilled about the new ones. If you haven't seen the old Bond movies, here's the basic format. You start off with a trippy pop song playing over images of scantily clad women during the opening credits. Then, James Bond is given an assignment to go to some exotic location and figure out what some bad guy is up to. Bond heads off with whatever gadgets or cars Q has prepared for him, drinks lots of shaken not stirred martinis, hooks up with beautiful women from around the globe, and uses some smooth detective work to infiltrate the bad guy's operation. At some point, he confronts the bad guy to his face, usually over a game of golf or a fancy dinner, or some situation where they both pretend they don't know who each other are, even though they do, and the whole scene feels like a conversational chess match. Finally, the movie comes to an end with a climactic set of scenes which use the vast majority of the film's special effects budget, and that also include Bond outwitting his opponent in some way or another. Now, this formula worked very well in the first three Bond films. However, after that, the films got quite silly. People often say that the films got silly when Roger Moore replaced Sean Connery in playing James Bond. But realistically, the last few Connery films were completely far-fetched, and Moore's first film, Live and Let Die, almost felt like a return to the world of reality, and is one of the better films in the franchise. But certainly by the time you got to the late 1970s and 1980s, Bond films felt like they had plots that you would expect to see on Saturday morning cartoons. You weren't sure if these movies were geared towards young children, or more likely since it was the 1980s, just an audience that was high out of its mind on drugs. So, in 1995, the franchise had a major reboot with the movie GoldenEye, where the goal was clearly to keep the hallmarks of the old Bond films while creating a modern movie. And honestly, I thought they did a pretty good job with it. I thought it still felt like a Bond movie while also feeling like a modern action movie. And I thought that if anyone was natural to play James Bond besides Sean Connery, it was Pierce Brosnan. The problem for old Pierce was that every single one of his movies seemed to be worse than the last. The franchise's longtime executive producer Albert Broccoli had died, and his input was clearly missed. By the time we sat through a movie about invisible cars and a melting ice castle, all set to an awful Madonna song, I think everyone was ready for another reboot in the Bond franchise, which is when we were introduced to Daniel Craig. At this point, the Bond films stopped even trying to feel like old Bond films. James Bond was no longer a classy and confident gentleman. He was now a troubled, twisted brute who spent all his time scowling and grimacing and sweating and sometimes sulking. That's for the few scenes where we even saw his face and didn't just see endless action. The movie's plots seem to be basically an excuse to have as many chase scenes as they possibly could in a 2 to 3 hour period. Now, were these movies bad movies? Not really. Okay, Quantum of Solace was, but the other two were probably reasonably good movies, as long as you didn't go in with the mindset that you wanted to see another film like Goldfinger. Meanwhile, I'm perfectly willing to admit that some of the old Bond movies were, by all normal definitions, bad. I would like to say that the old Bond movies were more intelligent than the new ones, as they more relied on Bond outsmarting his opponents rather than just outgunning them or outslugging them. But realistically, they relied very heavily on endless beautiful women to titillate the audience, which is no different than relying on endless violence. I guess I'd put it like this. I didn't really like watching James Bond be turned into another stone-faced action hero when we've already had a million franchises about stone-faced action heroes. By the time Casino Royale came out, we already had the Bourne franchise, the 24 franchise, the Die Hard franchise, the Jack Ryan franchise, the Fast and Furious franchise, and probably a million other action franchises I'm forgetting about because they were so generic. People insult the new Bond films by saying they're the same as the Bourne movies, which doesn't seem like much of an insult since I thought the Bourne movies were actually pretty good. But, since the Bourne movies already existed, I don't know why they decided to turn James Bond into nothing but a British version of Jason Bourne without the whole amnesia subplot. The old Bond movies were, if they were nothing else, unique. They put a different spin on the spy movie genre, which is why, 50 plus years after they came out, people still think of them as great movies, even though most spy movies from that era have been long forgotten about. And that's why I don't like the idea of modern Bond movies leaving out every aspect of the old films that made them stand out. That's why I would get more excited about watching From Russia with Love, even though I've already seen it several times, than I am about the new Bond film that's coming out whenever the hell it's supposed to come out. Now you can argue that they couldn't make Bond movies like this anymore, as modern ADHD-riddled audiences would never sit through an action film that was more talking than it was action. Meanwhile, modern feminists would never tolerate a movie that treated women in this way. And this is probably all true. But if that's the case, why didn't they just retire Agent 007 from the service altogether? Well, I can tell you why. Because the James Bond name is incredibly valuable. That trademark name is probably worth more than the rights to all of Ian Fleming's novels combined. He's one of the most well-known fictional characters ever created. Millions of angsty teenagers around the world who have never seen any of the old Bond movies and would probably think they were gay if they did, have heard of James Bond and will see a new James Bond movie when it comes out. And since these films will be seen by a modern audience, why not give the people what they want and give them a modern action film? Now you can say that I'm wrong, that the new movies really are great, and that the old ones are embarrassingly dated by now. And well, in the immortal words of the Big Lebowski, that's just like your opinion, man. What do I care if a few strangers on the internet disagree with me?